Good afternoon, and for those on Central Blytheville time, still good morning. Welcome to this third Blytheville Cold War Forum, sponsored by the National Cold War Center. My name is Christian Ostermann. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I co-chair the National Advisory Board of the National Cold War Center. I'm delighted to moderate this forum with Professor Jillian Hartley, co-chair of the advisory board based at Arkansas Northeastern College. The National Cold War Center is located on the grounds of the former Blytheville Air Force Base, originally known as the Blytheville Army Airfield, which opened in 1942 as a training facility for World War II pilots, and at the height of the Cold War was converted to a Strategic Air Command alert mission. Last December, the U.S. Congress designated the center as a federal Cold War museum. The mission of this U.S. National Museum of the Cold War will be to educate and engage visitors in the complex history and global impact of the Cold War, and to deepen understanding of this important phase in American and international history through immersive experiences on the grounds of this original U.S. Air Force facility. Or as we say, perhaps a bit provocatively, given who's in the Zoom room here today, telling the history of the Cold War at the place where it happened. I know my friends in Berlin especially will say it happened in Berlin.
No.
As well, and other places. We anticipate a grand opening of the museum in 2027. The Blytheville Cold War Forum webinar series provides a nonpartisan public platform for the discussion of Cold War history, memory, and heritage. In particular, the forum seeks to foster informed debate over the public history of the Cold War, and we very much intend for these discussions to inform the creation of the future museum. We also hope, with so many museums and memorials on the Cold War in the making, to offer a platform for exchanging ideas, experiences, and best practices. Today, we will look at European approaches to memorializing and exhibiting the post-World War II period. As we will see, some of these approaches, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, differ significantly from perspectives here in the United States. This is rooted in part in a different understanding of, or at least different emphasis of, what the Cold War period was all about. Looking at European perspectives on remembering this era will also allows us to see not just how different understandings of the past, but also different understandings, different narratives of the present shape, sometimes controversially, museums and exhibits. On the eastern side of the former Iron Curtain, the ideological confrontation is squarely in the foreground of much of the memory work, especially the oppressive practices of the Stalinist communist regimes. In Western Europe, the focus is more often on the geopolitical confrontation and the nuclear arms race. We have a terrific panel of experts to launch us into our discussion today. We'll start with Dr. Rajmund Fekete, the director of the Institute for Research on Communism in Budapest, who will speak about the House of Terror Museum in Budapest. We'll then turn to Dr. Susanne Muhle of the Berlin Wall Memorial. She'll be followed by Dr. Siepp from Texas A&M University, who will speak about the Point Alpha Memorial and Museum. And last but not least, turn to Dr. Farboel of the University of Aarhus, who will speak about Danish Cold War heritage. A technical note, the session will be recorded and published on the National Cold War Center's website. To join the conversation, for you in the audience, use the raise hand function on Zoom. Once you do that, you'll be put into a queue, and Jillian and I will call on you at the appropriate time to unmute yourself so you can pose your question or comment. You can also post your question in the Q&A function of Zoom, and then we will try to put those questions to our panelists. Last but not least, I'd like to thank the colleagues at the National Cold War Center for their support of this event, especially Liz Smith of the Board of Directors of the National Cold War Center. My thanks also to Peter Bierstecker of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jillian. Jillian.
Thank you, Christian.
It's all yours.
Today we have Rajmund Fekete, who is a historian and the director of the Institute for the Research on Communism in Budapest. Prior to his current position, he worked as a chief of press at the House of Terror Museum between 2013 and 2015. He was also a political advisor at the Prime Minister's office. He then served as the head of department, then chief of staff at the Secretary of State for International Communication. He went at Peter Pasmani, Catholic University School of History, writing his doctoral thesis on John F. Kennedy's political image. Twice awarded the Hungarian State Scholarship, he was a member of the István Hatvany Collegium. As a former fellow at James S. Denton Transatlantic Fellowship Program of the Center of European Policies Analysis, Raymond participated in the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy's Europe program. In 2022, he received the Young Investigator Award from the Board of Directors of the Association of Hungarian American Academicians.
So thank you for having me. So in Hungary, it took 46 years for this so-called Neo-Renaissance building at 60 Andrássy Avenue to be truly reborn and become a multifaceted symbol of the cruel and bloody history of our 20th century in Hungary. In the winter of 1944, the Hungarian Arrow Cross Party moved here in order to torture hundreds of our Jewish compatriots in the basement of their House of Loyalty. On my presentation on the left, you can see the entrance during that time when that was the headquarters of the party. In 1945, Hungarian communists arriving under the protection of Soviet tanks established themselves here so that Hungary's secret police, known as the Fist of the Party, could decide on class basis who is a friend and who was a foe. It was only after the 56 revolution on 23rd of October that the organization, the State Protection Authority, left its palatial headquarters in the heart of Budapest, the city's most beautiful avenue. By then, however, the wars had absorbed so much pain and suffering that time and history would embed the building's dark genius into the subconscious on the city. In December 2000, the Public Foundation for Research on Central and Eastern European History and Society purchased the building with the aim of establishing a museum and opened on the 24th of February in 2002. There is enormous power in this building. These were the words of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in 2002 at the opening of the House of Terror Museum, where more than 1,000 people gathered together. He continued thus, quote starts, "The power of the victims, the humiliated, those nearest and dearest to them, those who fear for them, the nation. A museum of instead of reprisals, recompense, or revenge." This is also a way of signing an agreement with history. The reason we need museums like this is not to give our children a direct personal experience of fear, terror, and humiliation that will make them shudder. We want our children to grow up in Hungary knowing what was endured by those who went before them. We want our children to understand that freedom is not given for free. So this building exists to protect the nation from its own shadow, quote ends. Opening the House of Terror Museum was a historic milestone because then, just over a decade after the fall of communism, Hungary was the first country to open a museum and memorial site that placed side by side two totalitarian dictatorships that had been forced on us by the powers that had occupied our country between 1944 and 1989. This took courage because in Western Europe, more than 20 years ago, the atrocities of National Socialism were considered unique and incomparable. But we ignored this prohibition because we were convinced that Nazi and communist crimes had shared roots. As a Nobel Prize-winning Hungarian writer and Holocaust survivor, Imre Kertész put it, "The one appears as a savior, and under his robe lies the devil. The other disguises himself as Satan and is in fact Satan." Hungary experienced both, in part simultaneously and in part consecutively, after decades of silence. There emerged a place where the protagonists in our collective history, the victims and the perpetrators, have been named, and not by framing history in ideological terms, but by asserting only the traditional values and the interest of national community. 63 Andrássy Avenue was an important site for the two totalitarian dictatorship. This location has become intertwined with the concept of terror in Hungary. What happened here could not be spoken about for decades. It belonged to a suppressed, unresolved part of our past. With the creation of the museum, we sought to initiate shared reflection on the decades forming our past and to begin the grieving process. We were able to distinguish the building from its surroundings so that everyone could see that it was the house of terror. We created a wide horizontal platform cantilevered out from the building's cornice, into which we cut the symbols of the two terrorist dictatorships. On the left, you can see the Hungarian Nazi Party's symbol, and of course the communist one, and the word terror. Sunlight shining through these voids projects onto the facade the totalitarian symbols and the word, which contrasts with the shadow of the surrounding solid parts of the platform. The shadow cast on the walls, painted gray to evoke the secret police that once occupied the building, symbolizes the terror that casts a shadow on our lives and in everyday activities. The entire frontage is in darkness when the sun is at its highest, evoking the title of Arthur Koestler's novel Darkness at Noon. The projected symbols fragment as they move across the facade of the building, because what they symbolize no longer has power over those victims, nor over us. The building is bordered by a black mourning frame so that everyone can see that it has become a monument to the victims. The site evokes the memory of dictatorships, yet it also signals to us that we need no longer to fear it. We can enter through its portal and it will reveal its secrets to us. Entering the museum, one is greeted by two huge vertical slabs of polished granite, identical in form, but not in color. One is red and the other one is black. The red slab commemorates the victims of communist terror, while the black one commemorates the victims of Arrow Cross Party terror, so the Nazi terror in Hungary. The structure of the exhibition has a strong framework. It begins with the Nazi and Soviet occupation, what we call double occupation, and ends with a final withdrawal of Soviet troops. You can see here the tank inside the museum. Under it, you can see that's not the water, it's oil. The tank that was the tank which was for the first mission of that type tank was during the 56 revolution. You can see the passage of the Hungarian Nazi Party, and the other on the two floors, the museum shows the nature of the Arrow Cross and communist periods of terror from October 1944 to 1963. The basement reconstruction commemorates the victims of both anti-human dictatorships, and the names and photographs of those who served both regimes are displayed on the wall of the perpetrators. The exhibition's farewell room depicts Soviet troops' withdrawal from Hungary, the burial of Imre Nagy and his fellow martyrs, the visit of Pope John Paul II to Hungary, and other archival footages. The images refer to present age, showing a democratic, free country, a Hungary where an occupying army is no longer stationed and where its free citizens can express their political convictions without fear. The exhibition has broken with the orthodox exhibition organization principles typical of museums. It has banished dry, boring text to information stands in the rooms, presents only the most essential data, and rather aims to appeal to the emotions with images, sounds, films, text extracts, and objects from the period from the past. The stories you see, hear, and read in our museum will reach the very depth of your soul. Once acquainted with them, you will have a different view of Hungary's history, Hungarians themselves, and Europe's shared destiny too. The exceptional moving, and often shocking exhibition of the House of Terror Museum is something you will talk about a great deal with your family, your friends, your classmates, or even your colleagues. Since the opening of the museum, people come to the House of Terror Museum both on the 25th of February, which is the day of remembrance for the victims of communism in Hungary, or on the 16th of April, which is the Memorial Day for the Hungarian victims of the Holocaust. Candles are also lit in front of the building on the 23rd of October. The same is true on the 1st of November, All Saints Day, and on the 4th of November, the day of mourning commemorating the defeat of the 56th revolution. This is the Wall of Heroes outside the museum, where you can see those heroes, those martyrs who executed after the fall of the revolution, after the 56th revolution. You can see here more than 200 portraits. This museum, this building, is a memorial and a homage. It was made a national memorial by those who wanted to remember the victims or the heroes. It is also a moral and political stand against the spread of ideas that led to political mass murder. Establishments such as the House of Terror Museum can have important role and mission in helping to clarify people's relationship to the past. Anyone visiting the museum and confronting the two inquisitions regime's events, protagonist, objective, tragic, derailed human destinies, will better be able to empathize with the meaning of crucial concepts such as victim, perpetrator, resistance fighter, opportunist, collaborator, traitor, inhumanity, compassion. This is particularly important for the younger generation. Copious feedback from visitors attests to the fact that for many of them, their visit to the museum was a cathartic experience. In addition to paying tribute to the victims, perhaps it is also facilitates forgiveness. In the past 22 years, we did more than 40 temporary exhibitions inside and outside the museum. This is the latest one, which is, we call it, it takes a great idea to produce a great crime. It is a temporary exhibition of the works of a pop art artist named Sam Hovattui, and this is Stalin with a Pinocchio nose and the Pinocchio head, and you can see here Lenin too. The House of Terror Museum was the first step in Hungary in a process by which the post-communists lost what they thought was their unlimited monopoly over the interpretation of the past, the present, and the future. This fact could not be better demonstrated than by the more than 7 million visitors who have visited the 60 Andrássy Avenue from cellar to attic over the past 22 years. Visitors who, when they see the exhibition, are truly confronted with the painful, cruel, and dark horrors of the past, because the past must be confessed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rajmund. And I should say that we're very grateful to you since you stepped in at the last minute, since Dr. Maria Schmidt, the director of the museum, had to apologize at the last minute. So we're grateful for your participation. Back over to Jillian. And if you could please not screen share until Jillian has made your introduction. This is to all of the panelists. Otherwise, that'll be difficult for her. So over to you, Jillian.
Thank you, Christian. Dr. Susanne Muhle is an award-winning historian and research associate at the Berlin Wall Foundation, where she is head of the Checkpoint Charlie project and is working on a new concept for the memorial site at the world-famous former border crossing. Her research and exhibition work focuses on the GDR Ministry of State Security, especially in the 1950s, the history of the German division in the Cold War, and the culture of remembrance in Germany. Her first book is a path-breaking study of the kidnappings of West Germans and West Berliners by the East German state security authorities, and it won the 2015 Opus Primum Prize from the Volkswagen Foundation.
Rosanna,
okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So I try to start my presentation as well. Okay, can you see it now?
Perfect.
Right, great. So I'm delighted to be part of this forum as we are in Berlin at the Checkpoint Charlie in a similar stage of planning a new museum on a historic site. And let me first introduce you to the historic site and the memorial site of Checkpoint Charlie, and then give you a brief overview of our recent and future steps towards creating the Forum Checkpoint Charlie with an exhibition about the historic site and the Cold War. So first, the historic site. Checkpoint Charlie is a world-famous site and a must-see for Berlin tourists. An estimated 4 million people come here every year, and we know from visitor surveys that they hope and expect to see the famous Berlin Wall here and learn something about the Cold War. One reason is this event, the tank confrontation in October 1961. The pictures of the US and Soviet tanks facing each other ready for battle in the middle of Berlin went around the world and became icons of the Cold War. In my opinion, this fascination with the site is closely linked to these iconic images and shows how they shape our collective memory. The pictures became iconic because they directly capture the confrontation between the two superpowers in the Cold War, tank against tank. Hardly any other image makes the East-West conflict so tangible, as both opponents are visible or can be imagined in this picture. Important aspects of the historical background and the course of events are barely present in the collective memory. So, for example, the GDR is a key player that triggered the conflict in its quest for sovereignty and thus angered the big brother, the Soviet Union. And the USA, which first deployed tanks to force Soviet Union to admit its responsibility for Berlin. And last but not least, the remarkable peaceful solution of the conflict. Checkpoint Charlie, I think, could have entered the communicative and later the collective memory as a place of peaceful understanding and not confrontation, but obviously the time was not right for that. The event made the site world famous, as I mentioned, and attracted many people even before the fall of the war. The fact that the Allied control booths, as well as the GDR border crossing and the border fortifications were demolished in 1990, could have put an end to the attraction of the place, but that was not the case. People did not stop visiting this former Cold War hotspot. On the contrary, the number of visitors apparently increased in the 90s. I attribute the popularity of Checkpoint Charlie to 4 aspects, which are sometimes interdependent. First of all, the media publicity for the site, which began at the latest with the events in the fall of 1961 and was reflected not only in documentary formats, but also in fiction books, movies, just to mention James Bond's Octopussy, etc. And these media gave the place an air of danger and spy thriller. Second aspect, the special situation and atmosphere on site, which was not only created by the GDR border crossing, but also by the permanent presence of the Western Allies. The 4-power status of the city and the division of the city and the division of the world under the sign of the East-West conflict were personified here, so to speak. And there always seemed to be something to see here. Members of the Western Allied armed forces, diplomats, and people from abroad who crossed the border here. Escapes, protests, and art actions that took place here and were reflected in the media. State visits, such as US President John F. Kennedy in 1963, and many others, which were also staged to great media effect. The third aspect is that Checkpoint Charlie was already a tourist hotspot in the days of the wall. As at several other places along the wall, there was a visitors platform, as you can see it in the pictures. And from these platforms, you could take a look at the border strip and the GDR border crossing. But in addition, there was the house at Checkpoint Charlie, the Wall Museum, a private museum with an exhibition on the Berlin Wall, which had been run here since 1963. It became a tourist attraction because here you could not only see the Berlin Wall, but also get an explanation of it with a strictly anti-communist impetus. To this day, the exhibition still breathes, I would say, a spirit of a Cold War. But last but not least, for people from Western countries, Checkpoint Charlie is their border crossing. This is where they or their relatives served as military policemen for the Western Allies or crossed the border into East Berlin. Many people still come to the site today with these personal experiences and connections. The attraction of the site had a major influence on the development of the memorial site after the fall of the wall in 1989. When the radical demolition of the wall began in 1990, and you can see how huge this GDR border crossing was within the city, and in 1990, there were only a few cautionary voices who pleaded for sections of the Berlin Wall to be preserved in order to keep the memory of it alive. And one of these actors was Rainer Hildebrandt, the director of the house at Checkpoint Charlie, the Wall Museum. But his plan to have a section of the wall at Friedrichstraße, Zimmerstraße listed as a historical monument failed. And he then created a kind of open-air museum on a plot of land at the former border crossing, where he exhibited various elements of the border fortifications. But in 1993, it was removed because the land had been sold to an American investor who wanted to build an American business center on this historic site. In the following decade, the perception of the site had reversed due to the increasing demand from tourists. While the required preservation of the historic site was seen as an obstacle to an urban development policy in the early 90s, the latter was increasingly perceived as an obstacle to the desired presentation of history on site in the early 2000s. The first memorial signs were installed at this time, both by the state of Berlin and by the private Wall Museum. They not only referred to the division of the city, but also decidedly to the side of the Cold War. The state of Berlin had an information board and an art installation with portraits of a Russian and a US soldier erected as a reminder of the tank confrontation. And on the 40th anniversary of the construction of the wall, the course of the border was made visible here, as it was throughout the whole city center, with a double row of cobblestones. The Wall Museum had the 4-language sector sign and the Allied control booth reconstructed. And that's interesting in the 1961 version. So part of the iconic image has been visible on site ever since. And today, sometimes queues form to take photographs of it, of the reconstruction. In 2006, the state of Berlin initiated an overall concept to commemorate the Berlin Wall. And according to this concept, the international dimension of the Berlin Wall is to be illustrated at Checkpoint Charlie. Until now, this has only been possible with temporary exhibits due to unresolved ownership issues. When the state of Berlin sold the properties in 1991, it obliged the new owner to make 600 square meters available for a remembrance site, but the investor declared bankruptcy after building 3 of 5 buildings, and that's a great stroke of luck for the memorial site, because otherwise the historic site would have been completely built over now. But so two plots west and east of Friedrichstraße at the corner of Zimmerstraße remained undeveloped until now, as the subsequent investors were also unable to realize their plans. Thank God. You can see the 2 plots of land And unfortunately, it took until last year for the state of Berlin to decide to buy back at least some of the land at the intersection of Friedrichstraße and Zimmerstraße, and thus created an important basis for the memorial site. But finally, there is now reason to hope for a permanent redesign. The new permanent memorial site is intended to deal with the history of the site and the Cold War as international dimension of the Berlin Wall. And this not only corresponds to the overall concept from 2006, but also to the expectations of visitors and to the visitor structure of the site. We see one of the great potentials of the site in the fact that it already attracts people from all over the world, and that we can bring them together here to share their experiences and images of the Cold War and its aftermath right up to the present day. So we are well aware that the so-called international dimension of the Berlin Wall holds different perspectives today than it did almost 20 years ago when the aforementioned overall concept for the commemoration of the wall was adopted. That's the first challenge. The second is that the Berlin Wall Foundation does not have a large collection on the history of the Cold War. And the third is a kind of luxury problem because we don't have really much space for the large number of visitors. You can see these two plots with white lines. So we have in total around 2,300 square meters. But we also have about 11,000 visitors each day. So it's not so much space for this number of visitors. And we are planning an outdoor exhibition on these two areas in combination with an information center. The latter will be the first place to go for visitors and offers room for seminars and events, as well as an exhibition area of around 500 square meters. And we want to make a virtue out of the necessity. So our idea is to use the indoor exhibition space, not for a permanent exhibition on the Cold War, but for temporary exhibitions. So that will provide the opportunity to explore different facades and hotspots of the Cold War in greater depth and allow for more participation and thus create a dynamic memorial site. It's our declared aim, starting from Checkpoint Charlie, to focus on the sites and effects of the Cold War all over the world, not just in the Northern Hemisphere, and to link local and international worlds of experiences here. It is particularly important here to take visitors' expectations seriously because they have played a significant role for the memorial site and should continue to do so. Despite the fact that over the past 35 years, Checkpoint Charlie has been a contested site in terms of finding the right way to remember, tourists have been proving it to be a Cold War site ever since. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanne. Back over to you, Jillian.
Thank you, Christian. Our next panelist is Adam Siepp. He is a professor of history and associate dean for graduate studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at Texas A&M University. He is the author or editor of several books about the Cold War, including Strangers in the Wild Place, Refugees, Americans, and a German Town, 1945 to 1952, and The Berlin Airlift and the Making of the Cold War. He is currently working on a book about German society and the U.S. Army from 1945 to 1995.
Oh, thank you very much, Jillian, and thanks to Christian and everyone for inviting me to, and everyone else, to give this set of presentations today. It's a real honor to be here talking with all of you. I want to stress at the outset, I think I should probably just make a quick disclaimer here. Unlike my two previous colleagues, I have no affiliation with the site that I'm talking about. So I'm speaking as a somewhat neutral party on this, though I would say I highly recommend that if any of you are looking for a tourist experience related to the Cold War in Europe, I recommend checking out the Point Alpha site, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit over the next few minutes. So my talk today is about one Cold War museum, a really kind of remarkable Cold War museum right in the heart of Germany. But I want to say at the outset that there are three things that I want you to take away from this talk, however you're watching it. And I'll make it brief, and then I'll sort of talk through each of those points in turn. The first, and I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to go after Dr. Muhle, who's a terrific presentation on the Checkpoint Charlie site. I want to stress here that while Berlin was no doubt one of the central nodes of the global Cold War, Berlin was not the only place in Germany to experience the Cold War. And in fact, if you go outside of Berlin, you see a very different version of the Cold War, even within Germany. So yes, go to Berlin, see these sites, they're terrific, but see more. So I want to stress that. The second thing I want to stress is that we have this tendency today when we talk about Cold War museums, and this has come up a little bit today, to talk about how the Cold War memory, the memory of the Cold War, is contested often deeply in East Central Europe. And we've seen this. So a great example today about Hungary. There are similar examples that you could point to in Poland and Czechia. I want to stress here that it's not sufficient just to say that there's contests over Cold War memory in Eastern and East Central Europe. I actually think the Cold War is still very much contested ground in the West as well. And I want to talk about an example of that in Germany. And then the third point that I want to make is that one of the real challenges to building museums about the Cold War is that, at least in Central Europe and in North America, the Cold War was a war that happened only in the imagination. Thanks be to God, the Cold War didn't turn into World War III. And so when we build military museums about the Cold War, we have to strike this balance where the Cold War, the violence of the Cold War, was really only realized in the imagination. And that's a real challenge as we think about how to build particularly military museums dedicated to the Cold War. So those are the three big ideas. Now let me talk through where we're going with this. So this is Point Alpha, looking east. I took this 2 years ago from the top of a watchtower at the Point Alpha site. It is absolutely beautiful. You can see that. You see the rolling hills there, the hills of central Germany, the Rhone, the Vogelsberg, the Spessart. It's a wonderful sort of area in the heart of Germany. And the other thing you can see here is that it is unbelievably remote. And that is really, really important for our story. So where is Point Alpha? Point Alpha is here. This is the least helpful map I can possibly provide you because, as you can see, in today's modern Federal Republic of Germany, if you stick a pin in the middle of the map, that is Point Alpha. Now, why is this important? Aside from just giving you the context, it's important because I want to stress how very, very remote this place is. Dr. Muhle just mentioned there were 11,000 visitors a day at the Checkpoint Charlie site. The best year, the last estimate that I've been able to find for the Point Alpha site, there are about 100,000 visitors per year. It is very hard to get there. And when you're there, and it is, if you're looking for a restaurant recommendation in the area, it is between the towns of Rasdorf and Geise. There is really no place to eat. There are no international airports nearby. It's really, really hard to get there. And that very blunt point is really important. It's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's a reminder that in much of Germany, the Cold War division happened in very rural places. And two, it's important because it cuts down on and will continue to cut down on the number of visitors who can make it to this really remarkable site. So, what was Point Alpha? From about 1951 until 1990, Point Alpha was an important node in the Cold War militarization of the inter-German border. It was a military position manned for most of that time by the US Army. I'll talk more about that in a minute. For more than half of the Cold War, the base was occupied and operated by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the legendary Black Horse, a unit famed for its aggression and its commitment to the active defense of the Cold War in the heart of a region that came to be known as the Fulda Gap. For those of you, many of you on this who are watching this will know this already. The Fulda Gap, again, a rural region in central Germany, excellent tank country. And in the 1970s and 80s, it is safe to say that there was no place in the world that was more likely to produce the beginning of the Third World War than the Fulda Gap. Again, we're contrasting this with the extraordinary scenic beauty of the place today. It was an incredibly dangerous place for the last couple of decades of the Cold War. It was the place from which it was presumed that the Warsaw Pact would launch a ground invasion of Western Europe. It was a place at which a tremendous number of tactical nuclear weapons were pointed at any given time. It was the likely site of the beginning of World War III. And that contrast, I think, is really, really important. And then it wasn't. On a November night in 1989, as everyone who's watching this will know, the Berlin Wall fell. March 3rd, 1990, just a couple of months later, the last combat patrol left Point Alpha, engaged in its patrol along the border, then came back and never went out again. Within the space of about a year, this went from a dangerous international border and the likely site of the beginning of World War III to a remote place in the middle of a reunified Germany. An astonishing turnaround, essentially unprecedented in the modern history of the world. It is an absolutely remarkable place. The camp sat moribund for a number of years until, and this is really important, we have this border here. It is also a German state border. It is a border between the German states of Hessen and Thuringia. Hessen in the Old West, Thuringia in the Old East. Beginning in the late 1990s, a group of local civic activists in Eastern Hessen began to push for the redevelopment of the site as a museum. And here's where the politics become really important. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. By the late 1990s, both the states of Hessen and Thuringia were both governed by, and I'll leave the complexity out of this a little bit, but were governed by state governments of the center-right, the Christian Democratic Party. And that's really important because it was the two states of Hessen and Thuringia that agreed in the late 1990s to jointly fund a museum site at Point Alpha, which opened in 2000. So giving you a little bit of the history, all of which I promise you is important in its own way. So let's talk about the site as it stands today, because it is a really interesting museum. The part that drew me to it, and Jillian in her introduction of me mentioned that I'm working on a book on German communities and the US Army during the Cold War. And I was really interested in this site because it is essentially the only museum in the Federal Republic of Germany dedicated to the American military presence in Cold War Germany. It is really interesting in that regard. So after you get out of the parking lot, because there's no way to get there by train or easily by public transport, the first place you go is the so-called US camp. That's their name for it, not mine. And it is in many ways a traditional military museum. And it is a terrific, and again, I have no affiliation with the place. I'm not advertising for them, but it's really good. A really good exhibit about the US military in Germany, very sophisticated, really quite, it's a lot of sort of positives and negatives, a really nuanced depiction of the Cold War American military presence in Germany. When you leave the U.S. camp, you walk down a path called the Weg der Hoffnung, the path of hope, and the way of hope. And along the way, you pass 14 sculptures. And these sculptures, again, are quite important. They were crafted by a local sculptor who had fled from East Germany as a child, a man named Ulrich Barnickel. And they are unsubtly Christian in their orientation. The comparison is quite clear. It is a comparison of the Cold War division of Germany and the sufferings of people in the border area on the eastern side of the border with the sufferings of Christ. That is not my interpretation. It is quite explicit in Barnickel's concept. It's quite explicit in the way that the museum depicts this. Again, this becomes important later on. Once you've passed the path of hope, the way of hope, you enter another part of the museum. This is where I think, again, this really interesting sort of twinning of the American military presence and the Cold War division of Germany. A site called the House on the Border, the Haus auf der Grenze, which is a museum, a separate museum, though part of the same facility, dedicated to the inter-German division. And it is, again, this is not subtle, it is explicitly aimed at portraying the former German Democratic Republic, East Germany, as a deeply repressive place, a place in which the subject population was subjected to all manner of restrictions of human rights, all manner of indignity. A large part of the museum is dedicated to the forced removal of villagers from the eastern side of the border in the 1950s, an unequivocally brutal and disastrous measure taken by local GDR authorities in the 1950s. It is a complex and brutal history, and the House on the Border tells this story in a way that is explicitly, I think I can say, pro-Western in orientation. There is no question that the presentation of the Cold War and of the American military presence at Point Alpha is what one might call a Christian democratic, that word again, we talked about this alliance of governments in the two states, Christian democratic portrayal of the Cold War in which the West won, unambiguously. This is important because the political orientation in Hessen and Thuringia in the beginning of the 21st century has not held. Thuringia's state government has moved steadily to the left, and this has created a bit of a considerable rift over Point Alpha. In fact, several years before COVID, I believe beginning in about 2017, the Thuringian state government started to protest about the content of the presentation of the Cold War at Point Alpha and threatened to pull out of the project entirely. Because of the explicitly Christian democratic and, in fact, Christian presentation of the Cold War and the post-Cold War at Point Alpha. It is a really interesting story. It resulted in some personnel changes. It has resulted in, I think, a genuine effort to try to rethink some of, though by no means all of, the presentation of the Cold War at Point Alpha. This brings me back to that point that I made at the very, very beginning, which is that we have this tendency to think of the Cold War as settled history in the West. And I point to Point Alpha as a place where that's clearly not the case. A place where the story of the Cold War, what it all meant, really matters in a way that is current and that plays a role in German life, German politics today. Before I wrap up, I want to talk about a couple of items that are in the facility at Point Alpha that I think are really, really interesting. So the first, I could talk about this for many, many hours, and people have to stop me when I'm talking about this map because I think this map is incredibly cool. This is a map of the Fulda Gap produced in 1983 by a coalition of peace groups. And you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you can see Point Alpha up here in this top corner, and you can see the words, "Here, the Third World War could begin." That's pretty blunt. This was a map produced in order to encourage people to come to a series of peace demonstrations in the fall of 1984 in the Fulda Gap, demonstrations that I've talked about elsewhere and would be happy to talk about in the Q&A if people were interested in it. And I also want to point out on the other side of the map, we have this sort of interesting, it's an interesting font, Fulda Gap, the first battle of the next war. This was not, well, this was done freehand, but it's not without basis. What you see there is the logo of a really fascinating board game, of all things, produced in 1978 by an American board game company. You see here on the map, it's on the board game itself, you see here Fulda Gap, the first battle of the next war. It was a board game produced in 1978, sold in the United States and in Germany only in American PXs, only in American military exchanges, that presented a future nuclear war starting in the Fulda Gap in a way that was supposed to be sort of lighthearted and, according to the game designers, kind of fun. The German peace movement seized on this map as evidence of just how uncaring the Americans clearly were about German life and German death. It's a fascinating story. I've told that story in something I've written, and if anybody wants to be in touch, I'd be more than happy to send them the article. It's Great story, if I don't say so myself. But this gets to that last point that I wanted to make at the very beginning of this talk, that one of the really fascinating things about telling the military history of the Cold War is that the Cold War happened only in the imagination, thankfully. But you can see here the visceral power of that imagination in this map produced by German peace activists and in this board game produced by an American game designer. The ways that the world thought about and imagined what a war might look like. But I want to wrap with this, because the communities of the Cold War that were at the center of the Cold War, the communities of the Fulda Gap, are now more than 3 decades removed from those days. It is remarkable the degree to which the small towns of Eastern Hessen and Western Thuringia have essentially forgotten their extraordinary role in the Cold War, and the way that museums like the one here and the museum about 30 miles to the north at Schiffler's Grund that marks the inner-German border, the way those museums are speaking now, not just to a global audience, but to a local audience, many of whom were born after the end of these dramatic events. It is so difficult and so important for us to remember and to remind people of the way that the Cold War changed and shaped the world. Museums have a critical role to play in educating generations born after the Cold War that don't remember how dangerous those days were, about the extraordinary story of the Cold War, the international history of the Cold War, and the way the Cold War created global entanglements that meant that thousands of American soldiers served in a remote spot in the middle of nowhere, now in the heart of a peaceful and prosperous federal republic. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Jillian?
Okay. It is my pleasure to introduce our final guest, Dr. Rosanna Farboel. She's an assistant professor of history at Aarhus University. She's the author of an award-winning monograph on Danish Cold War memory and politics of history, published in 2017. And she is currently working on a research project on Cold War bunkers and shelters, combining digital history, urban history, and Cold War history.
Thank you very much. Like Adam, I would also like to say that I'm not affiliated with any of the museums that I will be talking about today. I'm a historian from the university, but I've been interested in studying Cold War museums in Denmark for a while. My interest was sparked originally while working on sort of general processes of coming to terms with the Cold War past in Denmark. I agree with Adam. It's still a controversial period. It has been in Denmark ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have had really heated political and public discussions where left-wing, right-wing have accused the other side of national and moral treachery. So it's really been characterized by sort of a settling of scores. And roughly at the time that these debates sort of tended to settle, the Cold War was declared national heritage. And that's quite interesting because other periods are not designated as official heritage, not even the Second World War, but the Cold War is. And that also sparked a veritable mushrooming of Cold War museums. So we have about 15 Cold War museums in quite a small country. And I felt that it was quite interesting to examine the sort of combination between the very heated public political debate and then this heritagization process that turned out to be very consensual, very peaceful. So I was interested in examining what narratives these museums are telling, but also the materiality of the places. And I think that's something that's come out of all the previous presentations, the power of place and what the material setting means for the way that we present the past. And in Denmark, most of these museums are located in bunkers, so my talk will be very much about bunkers. For those of you who are not very familiar with Danish geography and Danish Cold War history, I would just like to point out that Denmark was a frontline state, bordering several Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union, Poland, Eastern Germany. And as you can see on this map, Denmark also controlled the access from the Baltic Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. And that meant that Denmark could potentially block the Baltic High Fleet from entering into the Atlantic Ocean. And that in turn meant that if a war was to break out, Denmark could expect to be withdrawn into any thinkable scenario of a war. And that led Denmark to give up 150 years of isolated neutrality. That has been the policy since 1864 in Denmark, but Denmark gave that up in 1949, applying for membership in NATO rather reluctantly at the beginning. But one thing that NATO membership meant was quite a heavy military buildup, including numerous bunkers. And these come in roughly 3 types. There are the military bunkers, there are the civilian bunkers, and then there are public shelters. And I'll be talking about the first 2 categories in this talk today, because they are the ones that have mainly been turned into museums. But when the Cold War ended, Denmark was left with all these bunkers all over the country that had become redundant. Their temporality seemed tied to the kind of warfare that characterized the 20th century. But after that, war became something that, quote unquote, we, the triumphalist West, did when we wanted to far away in former Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, Iraq, but it was not something that threatened the home territory. So as security structures, all of these bunkers were redundant. But they are, as you would expect, not very easy to remove. It's expensive, it's difficult. So in many cases, they were just locked off and left to decay. And here are just the 3 of the nearest bunker in my neighborhood. Some of them are in the middle of major infrastructure, some of them are grown over, and some of them have been turned into playground. But even if they have been largely forgotten, there are people who were working to sort of reawaken these bunkers. And at the island of Langeland, there was a naval fort built in the 1950s. And the mayor at the island, he sought in the 90s, when this fort was decommissioned, to transform it into a museum. He recognized the value of having a tourist attraction in the peripheral region. And he succeeded in 1995. And about a decade later, the twin naval fort at Stevns also opened as a museum. In the beginning, their main exhibitions, or the objects that they displayed, were uniforms, weapons, maps, military vehicles, aircraft, medals, etc. They were, places where middle-aged men would take their sons and their political conservatism for a day out. That began to change in the 2010s, echoing the cultural turn in general Cold War history. New perspectives like gender, religion, everyday lives made an entrance into these exhibitions. But these newer perspectives, and I'll return to this, but they have difficulties sort of transcending the very strong militaristic connotations of these sites. As I mentioned previously, the Cold War was declared national heritage in 2012. And the Danish Agency for Culture did this by choosing 33 sites that they felt were of national significance. And they were in Denmark, in Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. And when you look at these sites, all of them belong to what we call the total defense. That is the combination of the military defense and the civil defense. And the vast majority of these sites belonged to the military. Turning the Cold War into official heritage also sparked this process where a lot of the smaller Cold War facilities, like civil defense control centers, were turned into museums. And you can see the list here. Some of them are only open on a special occasion, but a lot of them have been proper museums run by passionate locals or people who used to work there. So these are just the recent ones. So as you can see, there are quite a lot. If you want to go on an excursion to Danish Cold War Museum, you have to, even if it's a small country, you have to set aside a lot of time to make it to all of these. And interestingly, they are almost all of them located in a bunker. And when you look at what they exhibit, they center exclusively on the total defense, the civil defense and the military defense. But there is a very clear sort of burden sharing here. So Stevns Fort and Langelands Fort, the military fortifications, They focus on the military threat to Denmark, the national defense, the fort's role in this, the fort's role in the defense of NATO. Whereas the museums in these former Civil Defense Control Center, they tell the story about emergency preparedness and civil defense. So the particular bunker shapes and influences the stories that they tell at these sites. And I don't want to argue that there is necessarily and per definition a past dependency here, but it tends to be what is happening in Denmark, that the material setting determines the history that is getting told here. No matter if the focus is on the military defense or the civil defense, war remains the central narrative. And the Cold War is told as a quote-unquote real war, much along the lines of how World War II museums tell the story of World War II. There are weapons, plans, maps, a strong focus on technology. There are very sort of strict chronological timelines from Churchill's Iron Curtain speech to the fall of the Berlin Wall. There is a huge focus on statesmen, on diplomacy, on generals. Very clear front lines, east-west, very clear enemy stereotypes. The good guys in the west, the bad guys in the east, also traitors in Denmark, agents and spies. There's no critique, no questioning of government policies. And there's very little attention to the fact that the Cold War was not just an event that dominated everything that happened in the second half of the 20th century. It is as if the Cold War has militarized everything and everyday life. But there is not any attention to the fact that the Cold War also became a condition. And you could almost argue that there is an everydayification going on as people led their ordinary lives. But the extraordinary war dominates at these museums. So the bunker form and the warfare narrative becomes very hard to separate. And the Danish Cold War Museum experience is very much one of bunkered warfare. Another quite interesting feature when you visit these museums is that the borders between history and the imagined future, between that which actually happened and that which could have happened, disappear. The guides that will take you around tend to present the plans and the what-ifs as if they had actually happened. And when I take my students there, which I often do during my classes, we will discuss every time when we come back to the surface, did these guides really believe that World War III had happened? Because that's the way they tell the story. And when you visit Langeland's fort, you can, in one of the bunkers, you can unleash a nuclear attack on the island where you stand. So you go into the bunker, that's the lower photo, and there's a screen there. And on the screen, you read a quote by one of the, in Denmark, famous generals of the time, who will be telling about Warsaw Plaque d'Attente to nuke that island of Langeland and the fort where you're standing with your family. And then there are two buttons below the screen you can push. And when you do that, the lights will flicker and go out. There'll be a terrible noise from hidden loudspeakers in the roof you hadn't noticed when you entered the room. The floor will start shaking below you because it's slightly raised or against something that you're not warned about, you're not told. Just suddenly everything is chaos in there. And on the screen, there's footage from American civil defense films and nuclear tests. You're not told where this footage comes from. You just have present the quote from the general about a nuclear attack where you are, and then suddenly all hell breaks loose in that bunker. It's a remarkably transgressive and bodily interaction with that counterfactual World War III event. And I would argue that this is something you can only do at places where the war did not happen. You could not make such a thing at Hiroshima. You could not do such a thing at Auschwitz, but you can unleash a nuclear holocaust in Denmark. Even though these sites prioritize what is extraordinary and what is dramatic, it is at the same time never really dangerous. When you compare these experiences of going to international Cold War museums or Second World War museums, you are struck by one very clear thing at the Danish Cold War museums. There's no death, no destruction, no casualties. Stemsford and Langlandsford, they're military sites. They proudly note the massive firepower of their guns, the yields of the missile, but they don't connect this information to the damage that these weapons could have done or did elsewhere in the world. So the museums lack one of the key characteristics of ordinary war commemoration: victims, loss, sacrifice, and trauma. Even the nuclear attack in Langeland, what you see is destroyed as buildings, but you don't see any victims. There are no images or photos from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for instance. So Danish Cold War museums, they managed to celebrate this triumphalist Cold War memory, but without having to deal with all the unpleasant sides of warfare. It also tends to be quite a nostalgic experience, sort of feeding on the myth of Cold War stability as a time where you know what life was supposed to be, you know who were the good guys and the bad guys, it's black and white, no sort of gray areas. And in the souvenir shops, you can get all sorts of model airplanes and Soviet memorabilia and all sorts of stuff. So to wrap up here, Denmark has witnessed quite an impressive wave of Cold War musealization. And at these museums, materiality, memories, and meaning are really co-produced. But the reappropriation of Cold War bunkers into museums, that will only prioritize the war narrative. That means that these sites become linked to war, pushing aside all the equally legitimate memories of the war, of the Cold War, as more than military conflict, as an ideological contest between different ways of life, between different paths to modernity. And you might think that, well, that's obvious because the bunker has this military connotation, it has to be a war story. But I would argue that the bunker is a very multifaceted site that could allow for many different and sometimes contradictory stories of war and peace, of aggression and defense, of fear and anxiety for the doom, but also of the hope for survival. All these stories are possible to tell at these bunkers. I think the Cold War sites have an important democratic potential to raise questions of crisis, of preparedness, of military spending, and of enemy stereotypes. But I also think that this counterfactual war drama blocks this critical engagement with this important topic. But I think it's vital that these heritage institutions, that are these authoritative and trusted sites of collective memory, that they qualify and nuance the debate instead of reducing it to mythical simplicity. And that mission is even more important today with the war going on in Ukraine, that has sparked debates about a revival of the Cold War, or maybe even a new Cold War, or possibly a nuclear confrontation. And these sites could help us, I would say, in navigating what it means to live a life with nuclear anxiety, something that we tended to forget, as if nuclear weapons just disappeared with the Berlin Wall, but now suddenly they're back. But we've lost sort of a language to speak about them. And I think these museums could have an important mission in giving us that language back, but that in prioritizing this sort of playfulness, this sort of harmless but playful interaction, they fail to do this. And that would be my final words from here. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Fascinating presentation as well. I couldn't be happier with the spread of these rich presentations today. I think they highlight some of the really important issues we're dealing with in memorializing and musealizing the Cold War experience. I think one sort of common denominator, really the enormous power of the sites, as I think Adam put it, but also the Cold War experience as still very much contested ground. Rajmund's presentation, I think, highlighted the importance of framing that I think you've pointed out very clearly in the House of Terror, the Hungarian Nazi rule and occupation is the German occupation, and the Hungarian Nazi rule is seamlessly extended into the Soviet occupation and Hungarian communist rule. Something I think that perhaps equates both of these experiences. I think quite controversially, you are surely aware of some of the critique that has been made of this representation, but it speaks to the power and the importance of framing. That's my point here. Adam also pointed to the politics of exhibiting, of displaying, of commemorating the Cold War experience in a German case. And, he's also focused very much on location. I think, a lot of things that you said about the remoteness, the difficulty of getting there, the, thinking about visitor experience in numbers, those are things that are very much echo discussions we're having with regard to the National Cold War Center. So I think this was really, really interesting. Susanne also talked about the importance, the power of location. I mean, there's sort of, almost too much power of the location at Checkpoint Charlie. It seems almost overdetermined, and yet it's taken this long to actually, come close to, being able to envision a museum there that tells the international story of the Cold War. And you, of course, have been a primary driver of this process. Rosanna too points to the power of location and the power of the sites, the power of the bunkers, the bunkered Cold War heritage, the bunkered way of telling the Cold War experience. So I think all of these are really brought out some really important issues. I'd like to see and keep an eye on those in the audience who are participating. If you have questions, I'd like to use the rest of the time, unless there are questions from the audience, perhaps and the panelists are welcome to join me in this. Focus on a couple of these issues with questions. My first one would be to Rajmund. Could you just talk a little bit about, I mean, you've made very clear what the framing of the House of Terror is. And could you talk to me, tell us a little bit about how the Cold War figures, how the Cold War as a frame figures in the House of Terror, or does it at all?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you all of your presentation, your lectures. It was very interesting and very informative to me. I have one note for Rosanna about the bunkers, just because I was in Albania in May, and that was the country of bunkers, and there are a lot of bunker museums, and it's good to see it, how they try to work on their past in a different way. What you mentioned, what you see in Denmark. But back to your question, Chris. As I mentioned in my presentation, the House of Terror Museum is about the Hungarian history, history of the 20th century, because our history in the 20th century was really hardcore history, started with the First World War, after the Second World War. But there are elements where you can, when we, showing what's going on in the West, and how Hungarians saw the Cold War era. For example, in the first room, at the double occupation room, you can see there's a big map, and it showed how the map of Hungary changed during the times started from the Trianon Treaty at the end of the Second World War. For example, there's one of my favorite rooms is the room of the whole of the propaganda room, which showing us the propaganda war between the Soviet Union and the western part of the free world. And for example, there's a Hungarian flyer there, and there's a big bug on it, and the text is that the Colorado bug, the most frightened, the most aggressive enemy of the free Hungarian people. If you see it, please call the police, which was, you know, it's a typical Soviet communist propaganda stuff that the Colorado bug means and meant the Americans, the US spies and the Western spies. And of course, for example, we talked about Cold War, about József Mindszenty, Prince Primate, the last Prince Primate and Bishop of Hungary. He was anti-communist, anti-fascist Archbishop of Hungary, and Cardinal Mindszenty imprisoned in the 60 Andrássy út. After the revolution, the 56 revolution, he went to the US embassy in Hungary, in Budapest. He was there more than a decade. So indeed, that kind of personal experiences we talk about the Cold War, but as I mentioned, that's not our focal point. For example, in the 56 revolution, the room of the 56 revolution, we put some background about that, and we put it in the international sphere. What happened? What was the main reason why? For example, you know, that's always a question. In Hungary, why the Americans didn't help to Hungarians, etc., etc. But as I mentioned, it's focusing on that two terrorist regimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps to Susanne, if you can talk a little bit about elaborate a little bit on the factors that have made actually, you know, getting a memorial museum on the Cold War have been impediments to building that, you know, by the year 2024. If you can talk a little bit about those factors, that would be, I think, helpful.
Yeah. So I don't think I get your question right. The factors for the new museum, or the factor for
what have been the impediments of actually
what does it mean, impediments? Sorry.
Hindernisse. What have been the impediments to getting to building a museum at a site that seems overdetermined to be a Cold War memorial site?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think the biggest impediment was that the state of Berlin sold the grounds in 1991, and the year before demolished all the border fortifications and the border crossing as well. And in the following years, the state of Berlin always follows the idea of creating a memorial site with an investor, so with the help of an investor. And they really been stuck to this idea. And it takes over 30 years to realize it without an investor. And now we have the problem that we have no money to do it. So that was the reason why the state of Berlin wanted to do it with an investor, because then they don't have to spend so much money on it. But yeah, now we have luckily a change of opinion in this point. And the other point is, I think, that there was no political will to create such a site because of the Cold War history. I think it was easier to create the Berlin Wall Memorial, a site in remembrance of the victims of the war, because that was a political will, through all the different parties in Germany. So everybody agreed in, okay, there must be a memorial for the victims. But I don't think that we have this common sense in dealing with the Cold War history. I think so in conservative parts, they are afraid that we will criticize the Western part of the Cold War too much. And in left-wing parties, there's also a kind of, kind of thinking that we are doing it too black and white, and we are putting all the devil sides on the former left-wing countries. So I think that's the second reason for this long duration for the memorial site at Checkpoint Charlie. But on the other hand, and I think that's a really important agency, as I mentioned in my talk, the visitors. We have a kind of voting per feet. So the visitors came to the site all the years and contested that it's a really important place, and it is a place where we can talk about the Cold War and the different Cold War experiences around the globe.
Thank you. Douglas Lantry from the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force asks, he writes, sites driving narratives has been a consistent threat of today's discussion. How might the stories you explore be different if set in, for example, an art museum or a non-military cultural setting? Besides the obvious emphasis shift, would meaning be significantly affected? I wonder if Rosanna and Adam, if you'd like to address that questions, but anyone else as well?
Yeah, sure. One thing that I think is interesting with the Danish case, at least, is that even if some of these bunkers are not military side, the story tends to be the same. It tends to be the war story anyways. So these civil defense control centers have nothing to do with the military as such, because there are, and that's perhaps the difference to the US. The civil defense in Denmark resorted under the Ministry of the Interior, not under the Ministry of Defense. It was a completely humanitarian, non-militaristic organization. So it has nothing to do with the military. There are no weapons and stuff, but they still tell this war story. And I think it could be interesting to have a museum that would tell this story, but also focus on, for instance, in what does it mean when you send out a leaflet with information to the public on how to behave in a crisis. We had such a leaflet in Denmark in 1962. We have just recently had a new one from the authorities recommending people under 40 to have iodine in their cupboards and what to bring in case of evacuation and stuff like that. And I think these civil settings, these civilian bunkers, could help us to tell this story, but they don't. They tend to follow the military structure anyway. If we had, for instance, an art institution dealing with the Cold War, I think they would perhaps feel more free to engage with Cold War history. And I know also in the UK, sometimes they use bunkers for art installation. So I think there is plenty of room for using this story, and because it's a very malleable past that you can do a lot of things with. But I think it also remains to be seen in a lot of cases, because we tend to be so focused on, oh, now here we have an air base or a bunker or a naval station. Let us use this to tell this military history. We're very focused on this is a way to do things, like there is a template that we just reproduce. And I think it could be an interesting experience to test. Can we go in different directions? Do we have to tell it in a sort of quote unquote traditional way, or are there new paths possible? But I think it's something that will have to be tried and tested, how that will play out.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, Let me just add a
Quickly,
couple
since
of things to this. Yeah,
getting-
so two really quick points. So one, 30, as I mentioned, 30 miles north of the Point Alpha site, there is a completely different border museum at Schiffesgrund, which is a preserved border crossing, and it gets about a third of the visitors of Point Alpha. So there's perhaps even within this sort of limited space, there's a lot more draw to the military site. And the second point I want to make, and this is both astonishingly boring and super important, is that military sites tend to be public land. And when when NATO forces withdrew from the Federal Republic of Germany, the land on their bases reverted to a rather obscure ministry of the German federal government. And this is not ancient history. I mean, if you go today to Mannheim or Heidelberg, you'll see continuing, as in going on right now, discussions about what to do with property that was handed back in the 1990s or the first decade of the 2000s. And so much of the energy around any kind of memorial site for the Cold War foreign military presence in Germany, which was enormous, concerns this land because there are still open questions about what's to be done with it. So much left to be determined, and good structural reasons for that uncertainty.
Thank you. Unless anyone has any final comments, we're at 2 o'clock. We like to keep it to that. I know it's late. Rajmund, you have a quick note. I see your hand is up.
Yes. I would like to answer to Mr. Lantry's question, if I may.
Okay, briefly.
Just shortly and briefly. The situation in Hungary was very different because it was a post-communist country. So after the fall of communism, a new democratic country born. And as in the post-communist eras, the post-communist, how can I say, stayed in power. They just put their power to the democracy. They became social democrats, etc. And when the House of Terror Museum opened back in 2002, there was a huge attack against it because the narrative. They said that narrative is not okay. The place is not relevant. It's irrelevant, the place. So there was a huge attack against the museum, not just from the country, but from outside the country, because, as I mentioned in my presentation, that was the first time when the new democratic Hungary showed a different narrative on history, on Hungary's 20th century history. And in fact, after the 22 years, that was we won it. We won it because the narrative for the people, for the ordinary people, was I will be a little bit ordinary in that case, but it became more sexy, fancy, and trendy than the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's clearly a lot more to be discussed here, but I think I come away with thinking more deeply about the power of the sites, as Doug says, driving the narrative, maybe overpowering the narrative, taking it, the authenticity of the sites as something that really is powerful, but, you also have to keep a perspective on this. I so much appreciate all of your contributions today. Rajmund, Susanne, Adam, Rosanna, and of course, Jillian. Thank you all for a really interesting discussion. We will be in touch as we continue to think about the future shape of the U.S. Museum of the Cold War. Till the next time, thank you. We're adjourned.